It's two games that you'll want to lure into the jungle and nuke. It's NES Works, episode 121.
Let my armies be the rocks and the trees and the birds in the sky.
Arriving just 2 months after the uneven but ambitious Friday the 13th, we have another movie adaptation for NES. Predator is going to be a mess, but it comes to us from Pack-In Video, so maybe it will be an ambitious mess, like Rambo. On their surface, you'd think the two games would have a lot in common, each based on movies featuring the biggest musclehead action stars of the 80s, both taking place in jungles, both involving a highly skilled warrior making their way through the landscape, while taking down foes with stealth and cunning, both being total sausage fests that only gave fleeting screen time to a single female character. Honestly, Pack-In, and in this case subcontracted development studio Clone, probably could have gotten away with simply reskinning Rambo for NES and calling it Predator for NES. But that, you'll find, was not Pack-In's way. No one would ever call Pack-In Video a top-tier game publisher. They don't even really belong in the B tier. Their games tended to be fairly sloppy, ugly, and unbalanced. But Pack-In rarely took the easy route. They usually failed to some degree when it came to game design and production, but not because they simply shoveled out low-effort, half-hearted fare. Pack-In Video releases genuinely seemed to make an effort to engage with their source material. Having spun out of a home video distribution business, many of Pack-In's productions had a Hollywood connection of some sort. And those games rarely settled for the standard half-hearted shrug of a Super Mario clone that so many other developers created. I mean, their Rambo trilogy for MSX and NES went from hide-lied clone to a stealth-oriented action shooter that more or less established a template for Metal Gear, to a wonky but interesting Zelda 2-alike. And further down the road, we'll see things like a Die Hard adaptation that involves real-time NPC routines in a free-roaming environment. The game wasn't good, but it was so far ahead of the curve that its failings almost don't matter. You will probably not be surprised to learn that Predator demonstrates a similar degree of effort to stand apart from the routine. At first glance, it looks an awful lot like a Contra knockoff, which, frankly, would be a fair cop. I mean, the fact that the title screen features a digitized screen cap of the exact frame of the film Predator that Konami traced when creating the cover art for Contra seems like a knowing wink. And if you've only ever played the first stage of Predator, you could be forgiven for assuming that it amounts to Contra but single player and bad. But then you survive your first encounter with the eponymous villain in Stage 4, and the game gives you an interstitial story screen before throwing you a weird curveball. The so-called Big Mode. Big Mode is precisely what it sounds like. Here, rather than controlling a tiny sprite of Arnold Schwarzenegger's protagonist, Major Dutch Schaefer, you suddenly take command of a double-sized Dutch sprite running through an auto-scrolling run-and-jump sequence. This culminates in a true boss battle against the Predator, who uses different tactics every time you encounter him at the end of a Big Mode scene. Big Mode looks like nothing else we've seen on NES to date. Thanks to the advent of memory management chips, the system's capabilities had grown radically beyond the innate capabilities of the machine that Nintendo had launched in 1983. But even so, the idea of controlling massively oversized sprites like this would seem to be more or less beyond the console's abilities. The NES could only display 64 8x8 pixel sprites at a time, and only 8 of those could appear on the same horizontal line. Yet here we have a Dutch that consists of up to 6 sprites across and 8 down, a total of 48 patched-together sprite objects, which my advanced math skills tells me takes up 3/4 of the maximum sprites the console can render at a given time. And that doesn't take into account the various platforms, enemies, projectiles, and Predator bosses that appear here. Color palette limitations aside, this is basically the NES putting out something on par with Altered Beast or China Warrior, games that would arrive in the US in the latter half of 1989 for next-gen consoles. I mentioned last episode that the Famicom port of Altered Beast was a sad exercise in sadness, and NEC would soon begin touting China Warrior as a massive technical showcase that the NES could never begin to consider recreating. And yet, here we have the lunatics at Clone and Pack-In Video doing this nonsense. According to a 10-year-old post at the NESdev forums, the visual shenanigans here are the result of the developers treating Dutch as an interactive background layer. His animated appearance and movement are made possible through the power of the MMC1 chip which had debuted back in 1987 with The Legend of Zelda and Metroid, where they made possible on-cart save files and multi-directional scrolling. But apparently the MMC1 could also do this, I guess through memory paging. Now we've seen giant-ass bosses made possible by treating them as background elements, a trick the Master System also used to impressive effect in titles like Space Harrier. But unless I'm overlooking some terrible game that my mind has erased from my memory in an act of desperate self-preservation, this is the first time NES players had controlled a background element. So no, unlike Rambo, Predator for NES doesn't look to Zelda 2 for inspiration. Rather, I'm going to put forward the suggestion that its inflection point was in fact Namco's Heian-era adventure Genpei Tomaden, aka the Genji and Heike clans, a game every bit as bizarre as Predator, and which similarly alternated between standard platform action and scenes of giant, chunky, auto-scrolling sprites. That's not to say that Pack-In simply looked at Genpei Tomaden and said, "Right, let's do this, but in the jungles of South America with a dreadlocked alien hunter instead of assorted yokai." The big mode sequences here may unfurl as straightforward auto-scrollers, but the other 80% of the game plays as a sort of proto-airplane hangar experience. Although each level in Predator involves leading Dutch from the start to an exit door, the process of getting there isn't nearly as straightforward as in something like Contra. Even from the very first stage, you need to do a fair amount of platforming, doubling back, and traversal to reach your goal. Before too long, you'll find yourself navigating multi-leveled vertical structures and attempting to climb cliffs and caverns to find your exit. Predator is not a Metroidvania game, but sometimes a bottomless pit here isn't actually bottomless. You'll need to drop into some pits in order to find a path forward. Predator brings to mind a number of other NES games. For example, when you find yourself in awkward platforming sequences that span multiple screens which transition vertically, you'll probably remember those annoying mountain scenes in Rambo, where boulders and gorillas would frequently knock you down back to the bottom, forcing you to climb up again, like in Donkey Kong, except way more annoying. When you acquire the grenade weapon here, which replaces Dutch's default fisticuffs, and is one of only 2 weapons capable of breaking through rock barriers Metroid style, its low arc and delayed fuse timer explosions will give any seasoned Kusoge enthusiast PTSD flashbacks to Atlantis no Nazo. Oh, and did I mention Metroid because that appears where the game got its start. As with Rambo, Pack-In appears to have first exploited the Predator movie license on MSX home computers before moving along to NES. Unlike with Rambo though, the MSX version of Predator bears more of a resemblance to the eventual NES game. However, while similar, those releases were not entirely identical. The MSX release lacked the Big Mode feature, something the Mad Lads at Clone added for NES and Famicom. In fact, it appears to have been the Famicom release's key selling point. Unlike the American release, Predator on Famicom begins with a Big Mode action sequence. Big Mode replaced the more nuanced and non-linear approach of the MSX game. In its initial incarnation, Predator featured fairly intricate stages and a system whereby you could carry multiple weapon types, each of which restricted you with limited ammunition that forced you to consider and ration your resources. The NES game goes for more flash, or at least a certain value of flash, but its stage layouts and mechanics feel far clumsier. Levels are frequently built to be punishing, even from the very beginning. You can fall into a sort of gully on the second screen of the game, a lower path blocked by a wall of rocks. The only way to climb out of this space is to collect the pine, weapon you'll find there and blast through the rocks to create a new path. This is a lot more annoying than it sounds. The grenade is tricky to use with a very limited explosive range, but also friendly fire capabilities that can gravely wound Dutch. It will roll a short distance unless you place it on the ground, but it will also stick to a wall if you place it correctly. Fine-tuning the grenade's placement takes effort, and all of your progress can be erased instantly if you make the mistake of scrolling the rock wall off-screen at any point. Rather than wasting active system memory to track which blocks you've destroyed, Predator just resets any item that scrolls off-screen. No worries, you say. I simply won't scroll the rocks off the screen. That's a nice thought, but here, an enemy soldier constantly spawns and respawns in your face, homing in on you as you work to break down the barrier. Trying to kill him with a timed, short-range grenade attack is a hassle under any circumstance, but trying to keep the soldiers under control while also not scrolling the rocks out of sight and undermining your efforts is an exercise in hair-pulling frustration. And that's simply the first third of the first stage of the game. That's the game's idea of a compelling introduction. You will probably not be surprised to learn that it doesn't really get any better from there. The levels grow more complex the further you venture into the game, and enemy placement becomes progressively more of a nuisance. But the controls never improve. Dutch never even gains the ability to punch while crouching, which seems, like something an elite soldier could probably handle pretty easily. Then again, Predator only appears to engage with its source material in the loosest possible way. Yes, there's a guy who appears to be Arnold Schwarzenegger during Big Mode, but he's a generic dude in pink throughout most of the game. Yes, you fight alien predators, or a predator, at the end of several stages, but aside from their visual design and a few specific behaviors during Big Mode encounters, nothing about these guys specifically pegs them as the movie monsters. Most of the game involves simply struggling with slippery controls to fight a panoply of generic monster sprites. These have more or less nothing to do with the film. I mean, there are some vague attempts to tie things in, like the way the scorpions roaming the jungle palette cycle through a rainbow of colors in an echo of the scene in which the predator examines a scorpion through its infrared mask. But then you have things like giant bacteria and indecipherable blobs of color drifting around, and these amount to generic video game fodder. And God forbid that the game tried to engage with the meat of the actual film. The movie followed the journey of a team of American special ops soldiers whose mission was disrupted by the unexpected presence of an invisible alien hunter, the so-called Predator. The Predator systematically kills off the squad members one by one until only Dutch is left to defeat it on his own. Being a John McTiernan film, Predator was tightly scripted and filled with memorable characters. Not always likable characters, but larger than life and capable of delivering some real zingers, and whose throwaway quips and comments almost invariably came back around to having some other meaning. In this case, the Predator usually ended up killing the soldiers in some ironic reframing of their earlier comments. I could see something like the Friday the 13th for NES format working here, where you can take control of different squad members as they inevitably face off against the seemingly unstoppable enemy, either driving the villain away or dying in the process. Even a format like that of Platoon could have worked, but no. The game completely jumps past all of that and skips ahead to the final act, with an opening cutscene that takes about 20 seconds to explain that the Predator has already killed everyone, leaving only Dutch standing. The game consists of a couple dozen stages that expand Dutch's solitary quest for survival into an ordeal that runs about 4 times as long as that actual portion of the movie. It seems like a missed opportunity, though to be honest, the game misses the mark in far more significant ways than this. I guess you could hold its feet over the fire for its thematic ineptitude, but compared to its questionable level structures and sloppy controls, the fact that you're once again robbed of the chance to play as Carl Weathers, and the conceptual cuts made to the overall design in order to accommodate Big Mode, Predator has much greater failings. Eventually, you'll reach a stage where you need to reach the door by making use of the damage knockback you take when enemies hit you in order to clip through the scenery and drop down to a lower level. This is not an exploit, this is the expected path forward. You may have noticed that I used cheat codes while recording some of this footage. That's because there's no honor in playing a game like this on its own terms. But, to be fair, there wouldn't be a worthwhile video game take on Predator for another half-decade or so, and even then, those relied heavily on the crossover appeal of the Alien franchise. And in any case, at least Predator is a video game, which is more than you can say for our next NES title. For all of Predator's flaws, at least it wasn't Taboo, the Sixth Sense. Now, in case you're wondering, the Sixth Sense is your danger instinct that warns you to stay away from bad NES cartridges like Taboo. To be fair, Taboo is something of a first for NES works. The first NES cartridge that doesn't really qualify as a game. Now, you could be snarky about some of the emptier game experiences the system has had to offer so far and say, those aren't really games, such as Stack Up, Sesame Street 1-2-3, or Kung Fu Heroes. But that would be an unfair exaggeration. In Taboo's case, however, it's spot on. Here we have publisher Tradewest commissioning the mercenary facet of Rare Limited, the facet that would basically do anything for a buck in order to fund its more meaningful passion projects. They combined their forces to cash in on the short-lived occult craze that swept America in the late 80s. I can remember my classmates at the time speaking in hushed tones about their spooky Ouija boards, the sense of disapproval at such occult activities among the grown-ups at church, the thrill of disobedience at dabbling in such evil mysteries with the memory of the satanic panic fresh in our minds. So Taboo leans into this. It's basically tarot, abstracted, and remixed to play down the card element to a certain degree, but, at least to my understanding, ultimately making use of the same arcana and the same readings as a proper tarot deck. Taboo fit into a second trend as well, video games as fortune-telling tools. You could trace this back to at least Nintendo's Love Tester, which measured the electrical conductivity of two individuals to quote-unquote judge their romantic compatibility. Fortune-telling entered the console space in a big way in 1985 thanks to Epoch, with the game Milky Princess for Super Cassette Vision, which of course you already know if you're a cool person who subscribes to my Patreon and has seen the Milky Princess episode of NES Works Guide in Epoch. Milky Princess fell squarely into the romantic advice tradition of fortune-telling, with most of its readings centering on compatibility between the player and a prospective partner. And that game centered heavily on astrology and the zodiac, as implied by its title. It's Milky Princess, as in the Milky Way, you see. Taboo skips the astrology in favor of the tarot deck. Divining the future through tarot has no more scientific underpinning than using constellations to evaluate your personality, but it does have the benefit of being a lot more fun. It's hard to imagine taking seriously the notion that the dominant constellation in the sky in your birthday would have any real impact on the human being you developed into, if only because it suggests that everyone born within the 30-day span of time would have largely identical temperaments and life goals. On the other hand, drawing a bunch of cards with values couched in symbolic meaning may not have any real substance, but it leads to results with enough nebulous expansiveness to leave themselves open for interpretation. Is this something to base your life on? No. Is it fun to dabble in with friends? Oh yeah, for sure. Still, I question how much fun Taboo actually offers. It somehow manages to be even less of a video game than Milky Princess was. At least that had a little king and balloon mode. This has nothing. It does, however, have the highest bare titties per minute ratio of any game on NES. I guess that's authentic tarot for you. Taboo allows you to choose a few different prompts, allows you to ask a question, and then shares your result. Although the game does an okay job of presenting these answers, the Taboo manual itself goes into more depth on the history and meaning of the various tarot arcana you'll see here, making it an indispensable part of the experience. It's a strange release, not a game in any real sense of the word, and incredibly limited in terms of just what it offers. It kind of reminds me of the sort of releases you see in the early days of a system, when publishers gold rush their way into a new market without giving a lot of thought to substance. Think Ping Pals for Nintendo DS. Except the NES market was pretty clearly established at this point. So it's more like a game retail landmine. A cool cover with a logo of the company that brought us Double Dragon. That makes a compelling hook for NES fans who took Taboo home, only to realize they had wasted a few months' allowance. I mean, I'm projecting and speculating here about those experiences, but that's fair because projecting and speculating seems to be in keeping with the material. There is some novelty to be found here, and it is a rare limited production. That means the graphics look nice, the interface has a great artful appearance, and the music slaps. But wow, Taboo: The Sixth Sense is the kind of thing that the rental market was created for, not the kind of thing you wanted to drop $40 on. I don't want to come down too hard on Taboo, because it's clearly one of those things that is not for me, but that doesn't mean it's not for someone else. I mean, look, we all lived through the Wii era, and we all know what an asshole you look like when you look at material that targets a wider, non-gaming audience and write it off with a knee-jerk reaction. With its strong production values, I could see Taboo having value for some other audience. So despite my misgivings about it on a fundamental and conceptual level, I have to conclude that it ultimately works out better than Predator, and that both try to do something weird, but only Taboo manages to succeed at doing it. And what did Nintendo Power have to say? Surprise, these games only got video shorts as well, although Taboo's video short was at least epic-sized, as such things go. Next time on NES Works, we're one wolf shy from an airbrushed t-shirt.